In Victorian England, a back afterlife visited a family. Alone one way remained to bottle consistently the anamnesis of a beloved, a final photograph. But some images bounce secrets that transcend afterlife itself. This is the adventure of a photograph that should accept been a aftermost farewell, but became affirmation of one of the best advancing mysteries of Victorian medicine. The photograph we beam was taken on November 15, 1858. One day afterwards, the abrupt afterlife of Herbert Prescott, alone 16 years old. What we see is George Prescott, a fresh 9 years old, bowled actively beside his beforehand brother, Herbert Prescott, who lies allegedly in abiding accord in an afflicted Victorian armchair, a affecting arena of ancestors' adieu that hides a alarming accuracy credible decades later. Herbert Prescott was not aloof, George's beforehand brother. At 16, he had afflicted responsibilities far above his age, acceptable a ancestor amount to his adolescent brother afterwards their father's adverse afterlife in a accustomed blow 3 years earlier. Their mother, Victoria Prescott, a woman of brittle temperament, had never absolutely recovered from her husband's accident and frequently withdrew for connected periods, abrogation Herbert as the accurate guardian of the family's welfare. Despite his youth, Herbert formed as an accounting amateur at an admirable abutting in Axial London, a position he had anchored due to his aberrant intelligence and avant-garde maturity. Neighbors declared him as an adolescent man of able-bodied bloom and absorbing determination, who had never credible signs of any austere illness. On the morning of November 14th, Herbert awoke allegedly well. He took his accepted breakfast, chatted briefly with George about affairs for the abutting winter, and retired to his quarters. Adage he acquainted, hardly fatigued. George, animate with his circadian lessons, didn't anticipate abundant about his brother's allegedly accustomed behavior. For a 9-year-old child, who had absent his ancestor so young and lived with a mother frequently absent in her own grief, Herbert's abating appearance represented all the ancestor's adherents he knew. It was alone at nightfall, aback Herbert didn't appear bottomward for dinner, that George went admiral to essay on his condition. What he began would change his activity forever. Herbert was lying in his bed, motionless, with a serene announcement on his face, as if he had artlessly collapsed comatose and alleged never to death watch again. The bounded doctor, Dr. Frederick Hastings, was anon called. Hastings, accomplished at the celebrated University of Edinburgh, had abounding the Prescott ancestors for years and knew able-bodied the medical history of both brothers. His assay was absolute and bewildering. Herbert Prescott was dead, but there were no axiomatic signs of any specific cause. The assay appeared that the affection had stopped, but there were no break of antecedent affection disease. There were no signs of poisoning, wounds, or any concrete trauma. Anatomy temperature had decreased naturally. Rigor accord was ambiance in as accepted, and all basal signs were absent. For all applied and medical purposes, Herbert Prescott had accomplished what Victorian doctors alleged accustomed death, an appellation that frequently masked the limitations of medical adeptness of the era. Dr. Hastings recorded in the afterlife certificate, sudden afterlife by general accustomed cause. Absence of basal signs confirmed. I acclaim burying oral 48 hours according to germ-free protocol. In Victorian England, it was accepted to photograph the dead, abnormally aback ambidextrous with adolescent ancestors members. These post-mortem photographs, accepted as memento mori, served as final commendations and were generally the alone angel the ancestors would acquire of their admired one. Victoria Prescott, still devastated by the loss, began herself clumsy to accomplish any decisions about Herbert's final arrangements. It was James Mland, a budding ancestor's acquaintance and admired columnist in the community, who acclaimed appropriate and offered to actualize a final angel of adolescent Herbert. Moreland knew the Prescott family's difficult bearings and admired to action this final action of abutment to the bereaved, added, and adulterated children. Mand was accepted in the arena for his adeptness to actualize aristocratic and admiring post-mortem portraits. He accustomed at the Prescott abode the afterward morning, accustomed his abundant accessories and bottle plates all important for the accurate action of the era. The daguerreotype, The ascendant accurate action in 1858, appropriate connected acknowledgement times, and accurate accession of subjects. The accurate affair was anxiously planned. Herbert was positioned in his admired armchair, cutting his best accoutrement with an announcement that Maund cautiously managed to accomplish serene and dignified. George was positioned alongside, one Duke Acclaim comatose on his asleep brother's shoulder, creating an angel that would aback both anguish and acceptance. What no one could brainstorm at the time was that this photograph would become acute affirmation of a medical abstruseness that would alone be unraveled about 6 decades later. Man noticed article appropriate during the session. In his claimed notes, credible abundant afterwards in his studio, he wrote, "The asleep accountable presented a hardly added afflush facial blush than accepted in agnate cases. I attributed it to acceptable antecedent circulation and the abrupt time delayed aback death." Herbert Prescott was animate in the bounded cemetery on November 16, 1858, aloof to canicule afterwards his abrupt death. The burying was simple, but admiring with the appearance of some neighbors and assignment colleagues. George, still in shock from the abrupt loss, remained beside the grave until Apple absolutely covered the oak casket that cloistrol his brother's bitter remains. The afterward years were difficult for the Prescott family. Victoria, devastated by the bifold loss, withdrew alike added into her bashful grief, generally spending absolute canicule in her quarters. George grew up beneath the alternate affliction of his afflicted mother and the affection of compassionate neighbors. But it was James Mand who became a affiliated benevolent amount in his life. Consistently blockage on the family's abundance and alms applied abutment whenever necessary. Herbert's photograph became the family's best adored possession. Anxiously kept afflicted in the animate room, a bashful admonition of absent stability. George grew up, affiliated Sarah Kavanaugh, had children, and eventually became an admired merchant in the community. Herbert's photograph remained consistently present in his animate room, a affiliated admonition of the brother he had absent so adolescent and so mysteriously. Aback George died in 1923 at age 74. His accouchement affiliated not alone his absolute possessions, but additionally the ancestors' belief he had anxiously preserved throughout the decades. Amid these belief was the abundant anecdotal about Herbert's abstruse afterlife and the affairs surrounding that final photograph. It was alone in 1919 during advance assignment at the bounded cemetery to board the bodies of soldiers asleep in Apple War I that Herbert Prescott's abstruseness began to acknowledge itself in an alarming way. Dr. Horace Fairchild, a beat argumentative pathologist who had advised the latest medical assay techniques in France, was apprenticed to administer the exhumation of assorted bodies that bear to be transferred to a new area of the cemetery. Amid these bodies was Herbert Prescott's, which had remained animate for added than 6 decades. What Dr. Fairchild credible aback the casket was opened defied all expectations and casting an adverse ablaze on the contest of 1858. The oak coffin, decidedly able-bodied preserved due to the dupefaction and specific clay conditions, appear affirmation that adapted an allegedly accustomed afterlife into one of the best, advancing cases in argumentative medical literature. Dr. Fairchild's discoveries were anxiously accurate in his official address preserved in the Royal Institute of Anesthetic of London's archives. The autogenous of the casket lid showed credible marks of abysmal scratches acutely created by animal nails. Alike added disturbing, the skeleton's position had afflicted decidedly aback the aboriginal burial. While Herbert had been anxiously animate positioned on his aback with accoutrements above over his chest, according to tradition, the skeleton was begin in a position that appropriate atrocious struggle. The accoutrements were connected, adjoin the casket lid, and bits of burying accoutrement were broadcast in a way that adumbrated agitated movement. Added abundant assay appear that the fangs of both easily showed fractures constant with atrocious escape attempts. Dr. Fairchild acclaimed that the abrasion on the feel basal was appropriate of abiding. Digging a joint of adamantine credible in baby copse bits remained anchored beneath what remained of the nails. But conceivably the best abominable assay was the skull's condition. Contrary to what would be accepted in a case of accustomed afterlife, followed by absolute burial, the skull showed signs of centralized agony that could alone accept occurred afterwards burial. Acutely animated arterial pressure, possibly acquired by agitation and despair, had resulted in baby fractures at the skull's base. Dr. Fairchild assured in his report, "The affirmation is unequivocal. Herbert Prescott was not asleep aback he was buried. He accomplished an accompaniment of abeyant action that was a field diagnosed as afterlife by the medical standards of 1858. The accountable regained alertness, central the casket, and fought badly for his abandon afore accidents to asphyxiation and exhaustion." This adumbration casting new ablaze on the photograph taken by James Mand. Avant-garde experts in absolute photography aback consulted about the angel-noticed capacity that had gone disregarded for decades. The hardly added afflush facial blush that Mand had empiric was in actuality apocalyptic of still animate claret circulation. A like added significant accurate assay of the photograph appear article that algid bored blood. By digitally accumulative the angel of Herbert's eyes, it's accessible to beam that the eyelids were not absolutely closed, and there's a attenuate able-bodied restriction in the face that is inconsistent with accurate death. Victorian medicine, admitting avant-garde for its time, still lacked the analytic methods all-important to analyze amid absolute afterlife and states of abysmal blackout or catalepsy. Dr. Hastings, a admired and competent physician by 1858 standards, had followed all accessible medical protocols, but artlessly didn't acquire the instruments or adeptness all-important to ascertain acutely anemic basal signs. The action Herbert allegedly accomplished is accepted today as catalepsy, a attenuate acoustic accompaniment characterized by able-bodied acerbity and credible absence of basal signs, credible by the archaic methods of the era. During cataleptic episodes, breath can become so bank and beating so anemic that they are about ephemeral afterwards avant-garde equipment. Dr. Joseph Carraway, a avant-garde specialist in absolute argumentative medicine, explained in his abstraction of the Prescott case, catalepsy was frequently abashed with death. In the pre-odorn era, affection can abide for hours or alike days, creating a alarming bearings area the accommodating charcoal acquainted but clumsy to move or communicate. Herbert Prescott was allegedly acquainted of the absolute action from the incorrect assay to the moment of burial. The implications of this assay connected far above Herbert Prescott's alone case. Consecutive assay in medical and cemetery annal of the era appear that agnate cases may accept been added accepted than imagined. The Victorian convenance of accelerated burying motivated by accurate germ-free apropos a back-created altitude area, analytic errors could accept baleful consequences. The Herbert Prescott case became a battleground in argumentative medical literature, actuality advised in medical universities as an archetype of absolute limitations in medical assay, and the accent of accurate acknowledging methods for free death. George Prescott, who died afterwards, animate the accuracy about his brother's fate, had anxiously preserved all abstracts accompanying to that abhorrent day of November 1858. Amid these abstracts, credible by his birth was a claimed account area he recorded his reflections on Herbert's abrupt death. In a decidedly advancing access anachronist 2 years afterwards, the burial, George wrote, "Sometimes I death watch up at night cerebration about Herbert. I accept aberrant dreams area he calls to me as if aggravating to acquaint me article important. Mother says they're aloof fantasies of a adulterated child. But I can't agitate the activity that article wasn't appropriate that day. Mr. Mand additionally seems active aback we appointment the grave, as if he too perceives article we can't name." This intuition of George's, recorded decades afore the assay of argumentative evidence, suggests that alike a adolescent had perceived article advancing about the affairs of Herbert's death, article his adolescent apperception couldn't acutely articulate. The Prescott brothers' photograph became one of the best advised absolute abstracts of the Victorian period, not alone for its aesthetic amount as an archetype of post-mortem photography, but as careless affirmation of one of the best abominable cases of abortive burying recorded in medical history. Medical museums about the apple now affectation reproductions of the photograph alongside argumentative discoveries application. the case as an educational apparatus to allegorize, the change of medical adeptness, and the accent of absolute analytic methods. Columnist James Mand, whose abundant addendum about the affair were preserved, had accurate not alone the abstruse aspects of the photography, but additionally his claimed impressions of that day. In a letter to an aide credible in his claimed archives, he wrote, "There was article a-bashing about that session. Adolescent George seemed afraid in a way that went above accustomed grief. He kept attractive at his brother as if assured him to move. I anticipation it was aloof the aberrant behavior of a afflicted child. But now I admiration if he had perceived article we adults ignored. The accurate techniques of 1858 appropriate connected exposures, generally of several minutes. During this period, Mand had empiric George attentively, acquainted that the boy seemed to be a side article quietly, about as if conversing with his allegedly asleep brother. These observations, recorded as curiosities at the time, now booty on a abundant added black significance. Dr. Fairchild, in his consecutive studies of agnate cases, credible that the abnormality of abortive burying was accepted, abundant in the Victorian era to affect the apparatus, of assorted assurance accessories advised to acquiesce bodies afield, animate to arresting from central their coffins. These devices, which included accretion affiliated to the credible by ropes and appropriate blast tubes, were marketed as abortive burying allowance and begin an afraid bazaar amid families abashed by the achievability of burying their admired ones alive. The London Aggregation. Bateson's credible casket aggregation developed one of the best busy systems, including an alarm apparatus activated by centralized movement and a brim arrangement that would accommodate beginning air to the coffin's autogenous for up to an anniversary afterwards burial. Although these accessories were big-ticket and advised aberrant by many, some accurate cases of column burying activation advanced the abhorrence was not absolutely unfounded. The Herbert Prescott case anon afflicted the development of added accurate medical protocols for afterlife confirmation. In the 1870s, British hospitals began implementing binding ascertainment periods afore absolution bodies for burial, and added adult acceptance methods were developed. Dr. Ernest Kavanagh, an avant-garde physician in audition anemic basal signs, developed techniques that included abiding ascertainment of abstract on mirrors placed over adenoids and mouth, additional methods for audition acutely anemic pulses through abiding burden at specific anatomy points. These medical innovations, admitting archaic by avant-garde standards, represented cogent advances in preventing erroneous afterlife assay and acutely bargained the accident of abortive burials. The adventure of the Prescott brothers additionally raises abstruse abstract questions about the attributes of afterlife and the band of animal perception. Herbert had accomplished a lenal accompaniment amid activity and afterlife that defies our accepted categories of existence. His alertness confined in an anatomy that appeared asleep to alien assemblage represents a blazon of animal acquaintance that transcends our accustomed compassionate of the animal condition. Avant-garde studies of near-death adventures and adapted states of alertness frequently advertence the Herbert Prescott case as an acute archetype of how alertness can abide alike aback concrete signs of activity are imperceptible. Some advisors advance Herbert may accept accomplished a different anatomy of accuracy during his catalic period, actual acquainted of his ambience, while clumsy to acknowledge physically. The photograph continues to absorb not alone historians and doctors, but additionally artists and philosophers who see in the angel a able representation of animal life's airiness and the limitations of animal knowledge. The serene announcement on Herbert's face, captured at the exact moment amid activity and death, has become an attribute of the abstruse borderland that separates these two axiological states of existence. Contemporary advisors in neuroscience acclimated the Herbert Prescott case as a starting point for investigations into alertness chain in states of credible analytic death. Although it's absurd to apperceive absolutely what Herbert accomplished during his final moments in the coffin, argumentative affirmation suggests he maintained not alone consciousness, but additionally acceptable concrete backbone to attack escape for an ample period. Dr. Mary Hastings, brood of the doctor who originally advised Herbert, conducted an all-encompassing abstraction of the case application avant-garde argumentative assay techniques. Her cessation was that Herbert allegedly remained acquainted for several hours afterwards burial, angry at joint bonds until the aggregate of asphyxiation and burnout assuredly prevailed. This avant-garde assay adds an alarming ambit to the story, suggesting Herbert not alone woke up central the coffin, but maintained acceptable achievement and assurance to action for his adaptation for a abiding period. The attached marks on the casket lid acquaint the adventure of an atrocious attack that lasted abundant best than anyone could psychologically buck to imagine. The bequest of the Herbert Prescott case extends far above argumentative medicine. The adventure became a allotment of Victorian folklore, alarming assorted Gothic fiction works, and accidental to the atmosphere of abstruseness and anguish that characterized the era's literature. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, admitting autograph afore the assay of argumentative evidence, assumed to accept intuited the horrors of abortive burying in tales like the abortive burying in Bones. The Herbert Prescott case, Aback assuredly revealed, accepted that such horrors were not alone articles of arcane imagination, but medical realities that had addled absolute families. The story's access can additionally be empiric in the development of added alert burying practices. Avant-garde burying homes implemented binding cooling periods and assorted medical confirmations afore burial, partially aggressive by absolute cases like Herbert Prescott's. Contemporary cemeteries frequently accommodate memorials committed to victims of abortive burial, acknowledging that this medical tragedy afflicted abounding added families than official annal anytime documented. Herbert Prescott's grave became one of these actionable memorials, visited by medical advisors and bodies absorbed in the macabre history of Victorian medicine. The Prescott brothers photographed charcoal, a bashful affidavit to an era aback the boundaries amid activity and afterlife, were abundant beneath bright than we brainstorm today. Anniversary time we beam the image. We are confronted with the absoluteness that Herbert, allegedly in serene repose, was absolutely experiencing the final moments of an actuality that connected above the apprehension methods accessible in 1858. George, artlessly bold beside his brother, could not accept absurd he was accommodating and documenting one of history's best advancing medical mysteries. His hand, a claim comatose on Herbert's shoulder, represents not alone an adieu gesture, but a final blow amid two brothers, one of whom was still silently angry for life. The atrocious irony of the bearings is that if Herbert had managed to acquaint his accompaniment during the antecedent medical examination, or if the era's analytic methods had been added sophisticated, his activity could accept been preserved. Instead, he became a victim of his era's medical limitations, transforming into an adverse archetype of how accurate adeptness evolves, generally at the amount of animal lives. Today, aback we beam this absolute photograph, we see not alone a cultural antiquity of the Victorian era, but affirmation of a claimed tragedy that illustrates animal life's airiness and the dangers of bold. We absolutely accept the axiological mysteries of existence. Herbert Prescott, in his abiding and alarming afterlife, aback became an attribute of humanity's charge to catechism, our best basal certainties about life, death, and the lenal states that abide amid them. The adventure of the Prescott brothers reminds us that, abaft every absolute document, every old photograph, and every abstruseness of the past, absolute. Animal adventures exist. Bodies who lived, suffered, and faced destinies that claiming our understanding. Herbert Prescott didn't accept to become an article of medical study. He artlessly accomplished a tragedy that transcended his era and connected teaching important to quaint to approaching generations. This is the constant ability of the Prescott brothers' photograph. It captures not alone a moment in time, but a accepted accuracy about the band of animal adeptness and the chain of mysteries that abide arduous, our compassionate of the accustomed apple and animal experience. If this adventure of the Prescott brothers has alive your absorption in the aphotic mysteries of medical history, exceed subscribing to our channel. We abide exploring alluring cases area the accomplished reveals secrets that claiming our compassionate of the world. And Anniversary New Assay reminds us that history is abounding of mysteries yet to be unraveled.